Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about pacing in narrative. And for a start, I'm going to be talking about pacing in books because there are similar but different techniques in film and in TV. And while you can sometimes use film and TV to illustrate a point, it's always by analogy. So when we think about pacing, one of the things to consider is there are actually two different things that we're talking about. And of those two different things, there are completely different elements that go into both. And one is how something is paced. The other is how we perceive something to be paced. And you might think, well, that's basically talking about the same thing. Not always. And that's what I want to talk about. That's what I want to elaborate on. So the first thing we need to sort of discuss is how we're defining pacing. And quite often, from a reader perspective, when we talk about pacing, we are talking about our levels of engagement and progress through a novel and our perception of how close together specific narrative events are. So there are huge assumptions that go into this when we talk about pacing and our perception of pacing from a reader perspective. So let's take a couple of examples to try and illustrate all of this. We'll talk about fantasy. So in fantasy, quite often there is a perception of this is what the story is about. This is the main story. That is a side quest or a side story. Therefore, main story important, side quest, side story unimportant, or at least less important. As a result, where is our attention focused? Our attention is focused on the main story, and anything that detracts from the progress of the main story, we are going to see as potentially as a detriment, that it is slowing down the story because we want to keep moving forward. And I've talked about this in relation to kernels and satellites. What we perceive as the main plot elements, the main narrative events that the story must have in order for the narrative to complete. Those are the central aspects. But satellites, you could remove, and the story can still go the way that it was going. But when we remove things, we invariably lose things. And it's whether or not we actually care about that loss. And that's why with satellites, sometimes they are about character development. Sometimes they're about exploring part of the world. Sometimes they're about giving context. But all of those things, theoretically, could be cut away and you'd be left with, here are the major plot elements. But the more that we trim away, the more it becomes a progression through, well, it's just focused on this thing. And the hero, they went here, they got a sword, then they went there to get the magical armor, and then they went there, and then they killed the evil dark god. They just needed those things. But the enjoyment of the story is quite often in seeing the characters develop, their relationships develop, in seeing how they change over time. And while those things are not essential to the main story, they are essential to character development. But if we do not care about the character development or the setting or the atmosphere or the tone or any of these other things, it will feel like a detriment. It will feel like it is taking away from our progression through the main narrative. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. The second thing to bear in mind is quite often when we think about pacing, we are thinking about our progression through the book, through the novel. So if you think about it, when you read a page, you have an average word per minute sort of count. It doesn't matter how many words are on a page. Well, as long as they're legible. Obviously, if they're very, very tiny, then it's going to alter how you see it. But you still read at roughly the same pace. You still read at your average word per minute. So if you have 10,000 words spread over 10 chapters, 1,000 words per chapter, you're going to read that at your average pace. If you have the same 10,000 words, but they're spread over 2 chapters, you're going to read that at the same pace. The difference is over 10 chapters, you go, I read 10 chapters today. And it feels like you're making progress. I only read 2 chapters today. You haven't made that much progress. And it is absolutely bizarre. You have read exactly the same number of words, but it can feel like you're making more progress when you read a complete scene, when you read a complete chapter, when you read a complete section of chapters, a sub-book or a subsection of a novel. When you're looking at a series and you go, this series has 37 novels in it, and well, I've only read one. I've read 20. So I'm more than halfway. It's all about perception of movement through, not about actual word counts or anything like that. But it can feel that way. Another thing to bear in mind is when we read large blocks of text, if a description is 3 pages describing a building, you can start reading it and you're reading at the same page, but it's all about the same thing. And although there are fascinating details, your mind starts to, yeah, I got it. Like, you become disengaged. And because of that, you force yourself to read on. It's a large block, one single paragraph that is spanning 3 pages. Oh, there's no let up. It's just constant. It feels like it is dragging. It is slowing everything down. And even if you're reading at the same average number of words per minute, it feels longer. When you're reading dialogue and there's a lengthy dialogue exchange, you're flipping through pages because dialogue has a lot of white space around it because of the formatting that we traditionally use in novels. So if you have a section that is a giant wall of text, you're reading all of these sentences, but you're not getting that sense of completion, getting to the end of a paragraph and moving on to the next paragraph and feeling that progression through. It's not being intercut. It's not providing variation to your eye. Because if you have description of a setting, let's say, for example, it's about a marketplace in a fantasy city, and the author has lovingly recreated what this marketplace is like, and they describe it to you, and it is wonderful, and it is vivid, and it's lived in. But this is 3 pages. You go, let's just slow everything down, because action is not occurring. Dialogue is not occurring. Character development is not occurring. It is arrested progress through the story. However, take that same 3-page description, and we're now going to make it 6 pages. How are we going to do this? We're going to have 2 of the characters that we are following interact with the marketplace as it is being described. So we have an initial paragraph describing this marketplace. Then we have the 2 characters enter and they go to the first stall that was described in loving detail. And then they have a bit of dialogue about what they might buy. And then we have more description as they move on to the next stall. And we have character development being done through the dialogue. We have actions as they pick things up and put things back and maybe have snarky asides to each other, or as a shopkeeper shakes their fist at them. All of those little things suddenly vary what is happening in the sequence. It's not just a block of description anymore. It's now breaking up the shape of the text on the page. It's adding in dialogue to give us more white space and therefore progress through pages quicker. It's giving us action, even if it is only minimal, about the interaction with shopkeepers or wares on on a shop stand, in a marketplace, in a fantasy world. But there's interaction as they pick things up, and we start to visualize it and immerse ourselves in it. And then the author can add in sensory information, not just audio in the terms of the dialogue or the sounds that they hear, and not just visual in describing things, but the smells that are wafting over to them. And then the reactions of the characters to those smells, the tactile feel of some of the objects they pick up. Now there's variation in this description. And because of that, because of this variation, we're not being fed this sense of things being repetitive. And because it's not repetitive, we feel it is better paced. The same thing happens if authors fall into repeating the same sentence patterns. If every sentence or a significant number of sentences follow the same pattern of main clause, comma, subclause, main clause, comma, subclause, over and over again within a paragraph, you might not consciously pick up on it, but your brain does. We are exceptionally good at recognizing patterns. And because of that, you get lulled into, well, this is just pedestrian and plodding. There's no variation. You're not having to pay attention. Your brain is being lulled by this repetitive structure. We have the same with chapters. If every chapter ends the same way, we can end up spotting that pattern and then feeling, this is repetitive, this is boring, I know exactly when this chapter's, you end up predicting things and not then enjoying the reveal. All of this can add to our sense of immersion and interest in what is happening. And the less interested we are, the more disinterested we are, the more reading becomes a chore. And because of that, we perceive it as slower paced because we are forcing ourselves to read rather than our eye being encouraged and dragged along the page. Almost against our will, we're trying to find out what happens next. And then we'll talk to our friends and say, this section really dragged. But our friends might be enthralled by this stuff. They might be really interested in the subject matter. And because of that, even when an author has used repetitive sentence structure, repetitive paragraph structure, or hasn't integrated multiple forms of writing in the sequence, because they are really interested in what is happening on the page, they feel, no, but this is all fun. Why are you saying this is boring and a slog? This was really interesting. Look, this is fantastic stuff, because it's catering to what they are interested in. Whereas we may be disinterested in it. It's not firing that our imaginations. It's not generating that spark. But authors cannot ever predict exactly what it is and where that line is for every single individual reader. They have to think about us as a class. And so that's why we have all of these tips and tricks about pacing, about scene length, chapter length, about sentence length, sentence variation, about type of sentence. Is it description of setting? Is it description of action? Is it a whole action sequence? All of these things impact how we perceive what is going on. And to refer back to something I was talking about earlier, about our impression of what is important and what is unimportant. If you think of Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time, it infamously has a section of a number of its books described as the slog. And some people will adamantly, vehemently, and aggressively defend this part of the series and say, no, but it's brilliant. And other people go, yeah, well, it was kind of boring. If we did a structural analysis of those books, we would probably find that it has exactly the same sort of pacing that the other novels had. So why is there this perception that it's a slog? And then when we compare and contrast it to the earlier books, we might realize that in terms of content, the earlier books had promised we are working toward this goal and we are following these characters. And then we get to a section where, a greater number of characters have been added. Now they are getting their own points of view. And suddenly we're diverging away from our expectation about what the main story is. And we're getting side characters and these points of view that are going off on digressions. And they're not developing the main story. They're developing side stories. We aren't interested in the side stories. We invested in the early part of the series, and this is the thing that we wanted to follow. We want to know how Rand is going to do this. And each time we come to one of those sections that's now detailing something that Rand is not involved in, or one of the characters that we care about is not involved in, we can become disinterested and we don't care. And if we don't care, then we feel that it is slower paced. So one of the other things that I wanted to talk about is what authors do in terms of pacing, in terms of their structure. And if you, this is a fun thing to do. Well, fun for people like me, but take one of your favorite fantasy books and take one of your favorite action sequences from that fantasy book and have a look at it on the page and look at sentence length, sentence variation, how many clauses in a sentence, how many words in a sentence. Have a look at it in terms of the action sequence. Now note, in that action sequence, is it intercut with dialogue? Where is it intercut with dialogue? Is there a nice big action sequence of lots of things happening and then a break so that we can kind of, oh, we had that action. Now we need a break to assimilate what just happened. So now there's dialogue. What is the dialogue about? Is it about what just happened? Is it prefiguring what is about to happen? Is there a moment of respite following action where the characters take a breather, and because of that, the reader takes a breather? And we get a chance to think about what just happened. Do they recount what just happened or refer to it in some way that helps us reassimilate what just happened and give it a moment to sink in? Do we then, and this is where I think it's interesting, go to a section that is description heavy, where characters have entered a city for a first time or found a new thing, and now look at sentence length, sentence structure, paragraph structure. Is it the same as the action sequence? Or have they varied it? Are they using the same structures of this is how long a paragraph is, and you never have more than 3 paragraphs before you have dialogue? And you start to notice patterns. You start to notice how authors are varying the words on the page, the structures on the page, our perception of what is happening on the page through manipulating these things. And this is what is fascinating about writing. And it's one of the things that sort of is very hard to describe to people who don't understand writing. When you talk to someone who goes, oh, no, but I'll just use an algorithm to generate this. The average sentence length for this author is X. And you go, right, but is that the average sentence length over the whole book? Yeah. Okay. Now look at the sentence length and sentence variation in a descriptive passage. Now look at it in a moment that is a descriptive passage that is post-action. Now look at it in a moment that is an action sequence. The variation is important, not the average. The average, these big brutal tools, are a starting point. They are never the end point. And so when it comes to pacing, our perception of pacing, our perception of how quickly we are moving through the narrative, our perception of how engrossed and enthralled we are, our perception of how quickly we are moving through each page, even though our average word per minute reading rate remains the same. All of these things affect our perception of pacing, and yet that will always be highly individual. Only certain aspects of that can an author influence, because they cannot know the things that we personally are interested in. They cannot know the things that we are disinterested in. They cannot know when we will latch on to a particular aspect and say, this is important. I want more of this thing, because that one thing may be completely different to the next reader. So when we talk about pacing, for me, it is important to realize that What I find boring and slow and that drags may not be the same for anyone else. And so recognizing how an author has structured something gives me something to talk about in terms of how a book is paced beyond something that is far more subjective about my level of engagement. And it helps me in understanding what an author is doing, how they are trying to engage their reader, and why it might appeal to other readers who are not me. But anyway, I've rambled on this long enough. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support. It does mean an incredible amount when people comment and give feedback, because then I don't feel like I'm talking into a void. So thank you for watching. Thank you for your support, and I will see you in the next one.